So what do I think of anarcho-capitalism? Well, it is an ideology solely reserved for internet-dwelling know-nothings and deluded university professors who really should not be teaching.
Oh boy, starting off with an ad hominem personal attack. This is going to be one of those videos, isn't it?
Why do I think anarcho-capitalism is a deluded fantasy and a joke?
Because you don't understand anything about it?
It is because capitalism requires the state to protect private property. No state, no private property. It is that simple.
So according to this guy, without an authoritarian ruling class controlling everybody, there wouldn't be anything entitling you to the results of your time and labor. I'm assuming you're going to give us an explanation of why that is, since this seems like kind of a ridiculous claim.
I know that ANCAPs are mostly internet know-nothings.
You know, you can usually tell whether or not someone has an actual argument by how much they insult and condescend the opposition.
But they should have a look at property law, which is one of the most complicated areas of law there is.
So this is an example of the is therefore ought fallacy. It's basically when you take the way things are currently being done and assume that that must necessarily be the way it has to be done. In this case, he's arguing that because the way it currently works, property rights are enforced through a complex series of laws administered by the government, that basically any conception of property rights would necessarily entail this.
There are many disputes arising when it comes to ownership of property, especially when it involves competing interests.
Nobody's really making the argument that disputes over property would cease to exist if you got rid of the state, but you just seem to be stuck in this mindset that these disputes must necessarily be resolved through the state, and the argument that anarcho-capitalists would make is that that's not necessarily the case.
What happens if several people claim that they own a particular piece of property? How would a problem like that be resolved?
Well, considering that anarcho-capitalism is based on a free market, there isn't really a single definitive answer to your question. However, that being said, you would most likely have private courts and dispute arbitration services. Because even in the absence of the state, there would still be a need and therefore a market for dispute arbitration services.
In the UK, landowners register their land in order to protect it from other interests. The registered title holder will almost always win over those who are not registered. So they register their land with the government.
Okay, well, in anarcho-capitalism, you just register your land with the private court. It would be the exact same process. You'd have a deed with a survey attached, both of which notarized by a third party. You just submit it to a private court, as opposed to the government.
ANCAPs, on the other hand, think property law is really simple.
Yes, and that would be because it is really simple. You own yourself, therefore you own your time and labor, therefore you own the results of your time and labor, therefore you have a right to your property. It's really not all that complicated. As a matter of fact, it could be considered an argument against the state that they need to inefficiently overcomplicate something so dang simple.
They don't take any of these disputes over property into consideration.
Wow, you must have done absolutely zero research on anarcho-capitalism, because anarcho-capitalists have discussed at great length, written entire books even, about how disputes would be resolved in the absence of the state. I don't know a single ANCAP who just assumes that disputes would cease to be a thing without the state.
They just say that we will have a system of property rights and no government. We will also have flying pigs and unicorns.
So this is a classic argument from incredulity. Just because you can't conceive of a conception of property rights that doesn't involve the state, doesn't mean that such a conception of property rights can't exist. Just look up any video which explains property rights from first principles. In particular, I recommend the ones by Shane Killian and Filthy Heretic. Links are in the description.
They just don't understand how complicated property law is. There are many issues that you have to consider. I have only mentioned one.
You've barely mentioned one, and didn't really substantiate or explain it at that.
See, these people have no idea what they're talking about.
'Cause the pot can't call the kettle black.
Can any idiot ANCAP explain how disputes over property would be resolved in an ANCAP society? You can't, can you? There you go. It really is that simple.
Well, did you hear that, ANCAPs? You can't solve disputes over property under anarcho-capitalism. You just can't. There you go, you just can't. It's that simple. Yep, anarcho-capitalism debunked. ANCAPs, you can just pack your bags and go home.
You need a government to maintain private property.
It's false.
So there's an episode of Larkin Rose's podcast where he discusses the absurdity of this idea that your property rights come from government. Yeah, the government that imposes a property tax onto your house and threatens to take it away if you don't pay, it's because of them you have a right to own property.
And hierarchy. Yes, idiots. Capitalism always involves a hierarchy.
Not really. I mean, capitalism is just a free exchange of goods and services in a marketplace. All decisions are voluntary and nobody really wields power over anyone else. Sure, maybe individual firms have a hierarchy within them, of managers and employees and whatnot, but capitalism considered as a whole is a pretty egalitarian system.
That is why you will find that only internet know-nothings and deluded university professors believe in such nonsense.
You do realize that most university professors actually lean left? Like heck, universities in general are just breeding grounds for left-wing propaganda.
If you look at history, you will find that most capitalists prefer corporatism and favor government intervention, especially when it comes to protecting their assets.
Well, thanks for admitting that, because this is something that left-wingers never seem to want to acknowledge. Yes, big corporations usually do prefer government intervention because it gives them special protections and means they don't have to compete fairly and openly as they would in an actual laissez-faire economy.
ANCAPs live in a fantasy world.
Life is just a fantasy. Can you let this fantasy lie?
Especially when they think their utopia wouldn't require force. It would require force.
Yeah, nobody said that anarcho-capitalism would involve the complete and total abolition of force whatsoever. Of course, people would still have the right to use force to defend themselves or their property. When ANCAPs say they want to get rid of force, they mean force as in coercion. People threatening you with violence in order to get you to make particular decisions or control how you live your own life. That's what they want to get rid of.
To keep the workers in line?
No. Under anarcho-capitalism, nobody forces you to work for anybody. You're completely free to decide which employer to work for, to leave that employer at any time, or even to not work for any employer and start your own business. The only legitimate use of force in anarcho-capitalism is to defend person or property.
And to force the right of ownership of private property. Private property only exists today because of state intervention. That is a fact.
Just because property rights are currently enforced by the state doesn't necessarily mean the state is the only or even the best way to enforce property rights. As a matter of fact, I'd even argue that the state does more to infringe on property rights than they do to uphold them. There's all kinds of zoning laws and regulations on how you're allowed to use your own property. In some places, you're forced to pay a tax on your property and they take it away if you don't pay. And with things like eminent domain and regulatory capture, they can straight up just take your property. Well, so much for the state being necessary to enforce property rights.
Indeed, when there was a lack of government power, factory owners were quick to employ hired thugs to use force against striking workers.
So he puts this little article on screen to kind of get his point across. The funny thing is, if you were to actually read that article that he put up, you'll see that the hired thugs that these factory owners employed were all nationalists and fascists. So in other words, they're people who primarily hold viewpoints that anarcho-capitalists would be opposed to. But even putting that little inconvenient fact to the side, do you think that people would never figure out how to deal with these hired thugs under anarcho-capitalism? Like if there was no state, these factory owners and business owners would just be able to continuously do this indefinitely without any consequences? Because I can think of several solutions you could come up with under anarcho-capitalism. One of them could be the workers could form a union and hire thugs of their own to protect them. Another one could be exposing what these factory owners are doing through the media and organizing a boycott against their business.
So the ANCAP utopia would likely end up being a dictatorship of those who own the means of production over the majority who don't.
Well, means of production is kind of an arbitrary concept. If you think about it, anything can really be a means of production. That's because if something provides utility to you, it can also be used to provide utility to someone else. Like if I can use my car to transport myself around, I can also use it to transport other people around. This is one of the problems with socialists. They throw this term around a lot, but never really give a solid definition of what it actually entails.
Whilst I'm not an anarchist, I do acknowledge that there are real anarchists.
Okay, I'm going to say this right now. Anarcho-capitalists are the real anarchists because they actually believe in individual liberty and property rights, while you social anarchists claim to want to abolish the state, but always usually end up proposing something functionally equivalent, like a council of people who subjugate our individual rights to the collective.
Who have even put their ideas into practice. For example, there are many documentaries about anarchist Catalonia.
As the chaos subsided, this new revolutionary society began to function. Much of the Catalan economy was now being run by the workers themselves. In Barcelona, trams and cinemas, factories, department stores, and even greyhound tracks were run by their own employees. The trade unions saw to food supplies. Union lorries drove out to the villages with goods to exchange for food. Barter, not purchasing, kept Barcelona fed for the first weeks of the Civil War. In some places, money itself, seen by anarchists as inherently evil, was abolished.
Anarchists don't think that money is evil, they think that government is evil. Like, not all anarchists are against money.
Shopping was done with vouchers, issued by local committees.
Okay, so they didn't use money, they used vouchers issued by the local community. You know, it's extremely funny how socialists always talk about how they want to abolish money, but whenever you ask them what their alternative is, it's usually something functionally equivalent. They just don't call it money, they call it vouchers or tokens or whatever.
Where were the capitalists when this experiment was occurring? Oh right, they were begging to be rescued by fascism. They wanted the state to intervene and crush those who were a threat to their economic power.
You know, funny enough, he's actually making an argument for anarcho-capitalism here. You see, under anarcho-capitalism, you're free to do whatever you want with your own property, and make whatever voluntary arrangements you want with other people, so long as no third party is having their rights violated in the process. That being said, most anarcho-capitalists aren't against small-scale socialist experiments. Like, if a bunch of socialists want to come together and start a commune or a co-op or something like that, most ANCAPs wouldn't have a problem with it. As long as you're not forcing anyone to participate who doesn't want to, we're not going to do anything to stop you.
Like I said, anarcho-capitalism, oxymoron. Emphasis on the moron part of the word.
Yeah, haha, real funny. But if you want to talk about things that are moronic, the graphic he uses at the beginning and end of this video compares anarcho-capitalism to feudalism. The problem with that is that in order to have feudalism, you have to be able to coerce people to work for you against their consent, which is something that you don't get to do under anarcho-capitalism, which is why this comparison is idiotic. Yeah, this video is a pretty big fail. He claims that anarcho-capitalism is an oxymoron, but never really gives a well-fleshed out explanation of why that's the case. He just claims that capitalism needs the state in order to function, without actually explaining why that is. On top of that, him frequently insulting and condescending the opposing viewpoint does reaffirm that he doesn't have much in terms of argumentation. Yeah, this video, epic fail. This has been Philosophossum making stupidity plague dead. Until next time, take care.